Hey everybody, this is Rydo, and today I want to look at some of the games that are available through what is basically an emulator on Steam for the Sega Genesis games. In particular, I felt it necessary to mention that as I had just played recently the Shantae series, that there is a game that in a weird way, the newest spiritual successor of this series feels a lot like the Shantae series, and that game is Monster Boy. And let me see if I can pull it up real quick. Monster Boy and the Cursed Kingdom, which is a 2019 spiritual successor from the creator of the Wonder Boy in Monster World series, which is an arcade series that I think mostly would be remembered as a Sega Genesis series, and they do exist in this Sega Genesis Mega Drive compilation, of which there's a lot of games, and you pretty much have to get all the games at this point. There's a nice little intro when this starts showing you off all the, I think, specifically owned by Sega products, and I would say a lot of these other ones, like I imagine Shinobi 3 isn't actually owned in completely by Sega, but they have enough of a relationship that probably would never disappear either. There's definitely a lot of games here, though. If you were a child when the Master System was around and you had this many games on your shelf, you'd be very happy. But oddly, it only includes Wonder Boy 2, or a slight modification of Wonder Boy. I'm not sure how different Wonder Boy in Monster World is really compared to Wonder Boy in its original title, and Wonder Boy 3 Monsters Lair, which oddly puts you in a weird position because there is an emulator software called RetroArch that is now available on Steam, and you could just have the ROMs. You very possibly could get the ROMs directly out of the files of this emulator front end, and use RetroArch, which is a much more open source yet standard solution for running emulators for all kinds of consoles, not just the Sega Master System. There is also a lot of visual polish here that isn't in RetroArch, but it's not really to much end because you're just gonna kind of waste it. Things like achievements on Steam, sure, you get that with this compared to RetroArch, but then there is retro achievements that you can connect RetroArch to, where people are running a website to put in achievements into old games that wouldn't have had achievements in there. And then these challenges seem to be specific challenges to only a small collection of games. This game was initially released episodically in volumes. I guess you don't get a Golden Axe poster in the background with RetroArch, if that's something. But then you have to come over here and look at the room settings to change the front end resolution and turn up the quality. It was at the simplest quality possible, and I had to turn it all the way up. I turned off VSync if you want to change the languages. All of that is different, and then the clock itself seems to be accurate, so I don't know. I guess you could have it pretend like it was a different time instead of just being auto mode, which, like, that's really unnecessary stuff. Then when you go to the audio settings, you have very basic audio settings, but you can't really expect too much from old games anyways, other than the fact that there's a game volume, a UI volume, and an ambient volume, as if there's going to be ambient noise when you're emulating the game. That doesn't sound attractive. When you actually go to the TV settings, this is where you would go and either start playing it in this screen mode or change it to full screen mode to jump into a game. As far as actual emulator settings, you're not given really a lot. First of all, it doesn't seem like you have a default setting that you can change for each game. It just seems like you have a default setting in general. I guess we'll try this XOR. They say that is similar to high quality 4x, except it uses 2 stages set of interpolating lines, better handling of complex patterns. You could turn on scan lines. All of this is very available in RetroArch. You could stretch the full screen out. You could disable it so it doesn't start in full screen. You could disable a sprite limit of the master system, but that's the only internal emulator setting you can really do. And then you can have a border art of a grid, or circuit, or jazz, or wood, or Sonic, or streets, or stripes, or black. And almost certainly you would want black. And then you can eject the cartridge, which there is no cartridge even enabled, so perhaps you change the settings when you actually choose a game. And then your input settings here are very basic, very much a pop-up screen that was not polished as much. So I'm not sure at what point I could really justify playing any of these games. I think I may have played some more modern games based on Biohazard, so there would have been a justification to play that. But things like Comic Zone, there's not going to be a remake of Comic Zone anytime soon, although it'd be kind of funny if there was. Playing this Crackdown has nothing to do with the Microsoft Crackdown trilogy. If I wanted to play all the Sonic games, they're all here. If I wanted to play Echo the Dolphin, they're all here. Unfortunately, like NES games and Master System games of the time, all of those games are really, really hard and not really worth playing in retrospect unless you have just huge nostalgia. Like, it would be pretty crazy to try and get a modern new player, a child, to play something like Echo the Dolphin for more than 5 minutes. And in all honesty, that was my experience even when Echo the Dolphin was brand new, is that these games were super small. If they're anything like NES games, they were programmed in assembler and not a programming language per se, and they had to do everything they could possibly do to make the game last as long as possible to justify the, by modern equivalence, $80 price tag for a video game. The Sonic games are about the best options here, and then you'll see some of them have like some extra stuff and some other bumps, and apparently some of them will have mods that you can put on them. Let's see what the mods actually are. I guess you probably have to go through the Steam Workshop to find them. The biggest deal about this was you can kind of see that they didn't make their shelves long enough, or they were just planning on releasing more games, and they never did. And they pretty much just sell each of these games for about 99 cents, but now you can really only buy them all together. But then I got them gifted to me through either Humble Bundles or just free game giveaways. So I definitely have some game codes for a couple of these Sega Genesis games as individual games, even though I already have them all. So let's look at Wonder Boy and Monsterland. It's worth mentioning that the Wonder Boy / Monster World series is a lot more popular in Japan, and in 1986 Wonder Boy came out originally for arcade, and then it was ported to the Master System and many other things. Latest would be Wii, and then the next year Wonder Boy and Monsterland came out, also under the names of Super Wonder Boy Monster World in Japan, or Super Wonder Boy in Monster Land by Activision. And then Wonder Boy 3 came out in '88. And then Wonder Boy 3 The Dragon's Trap came out in '89. Which these definitely don't feel like there'd be much changes between a game titled Wonder Boy 3 and Wonder Boy 3 The Dragon's Trap, or versus Wonder Boy 3 Monster Lair. Then you have Wonder Boy in Monster Land. Wonder Boy in Monster World, which is the 1999 release of, which sounds like it's a re-release of Wonder Boy in Monster Land. So actually this is the third game and the fourth game. The first and second are missing. And see, it's really confusing to keep around that. And then 1994 there was Monster World 4, which came out for the Sega Genesis Mega Drive, and then eventually was only ported to the Wii. And then it skips for a good 12 years, I would say. And then you have Wonder Boy Returns for Microsoft Windows, which is a remake of Wonder Boy in 2016. And these are the games I don't actually own. So if I was going to try and do a series for it, I would have to fork over quite a bit of cash to buy 5 or 6 fairly premiumly priced Wonder Boy games. But I think the remakes of the old games, just using the small bit of nostalgia, which is probably a lot higher in Japan, makes more sense than trying to play any of these old games. Wonder Boy and the Dragon's Trap comes out the next year for the PlayStation 4, Xbox One, and Switch, and then eventually is ported. And that's the remake of Wonder Boy 3, The Dragon's Trap. And then Monster Boy and the Cursed Kingdom comes out in 2018. And that is the game I think that is closest to the Shantae series in the fact that you are playing a platforming adventure game and you can turn into monsters like Shantae can. It is also worth mentioning that the developers for these last 3 games in the remake series have been all over the place. The Wonder Boy Returns was developed and published by CFK. Wonder Boy and the Dragon's Trap was developed by Lizard Cube and published by Dotemu. That's Dotemu. Monster Boy and the Cursed Kingdom was developed by Game Atelier, Atelier, and published by FDG Entertainment. And that was in 2018 for the Xbox One, PS4, and Switch. Eventually ported to Microsoft Windows and Stadia. And they have just announced, and I think it's worth mentioning this too, Wonder Boy Asha and in Monster World. Asha is a female protagonist of the Wonder Boy Monster World series. And that's supposedly going to come out in 2021. So there's definitely a lot there. I also wanted to mention that some of these have like regions, and that says left trigger 3, which when you click on it, which is not what I would call the left center click, says L3. So you can play it in English or Japanese versions for some of the games. So let's hop in here. That loads it into the cartridge and just jumps in here. Apologies for the long setup there. And all you can do is press the start button. And let's see, the controls are all over the place. So Wonder Boy is to the left. I don't think is Asha, ASHA. But also, I'm playing this on the Xbox One controller, and I'm not sure how well that controller will work. So, X seems to be jump. When you pause, you just pause. Back button to hold to exit. and A seems to be a like the B button seems to be a jump and A seems to attack, and you seem to have a limited number of attacks, and then you fly, and at some point it probably will drop you. This is a very basic game, but you could definitely see where the Shantae series is getting influences from. There's nothing wrong with this. This looks very nice. But let me tell you, you can rewind things in RetroArch, and I just pulled the left trigger in that rewound time. I pulled the right trigger in that fast forward time. It does drop you. There are ways to save replays that probably aren't here. There are ways to make snapshots and load snapshots in RetroArch so that you could effectively make your own checkpoints. RetroArch, this really is going to be an advertisement for playing even games you've legitimately bought and have their own interfaces. You are better off playing them on RetroArch because you can definitely take a game like this that is going to be using at most 3 buttons from a Master System controller and take the many other buttons. D-pad work here works fairly well. And now we have a flying section. Shantae did not go in that direction at all. I've never actually played this game before, but I was more of a Nintendo fanboy, so no surprise there that I only had like a friend that had a Sega Genesis, and by the time they actually did have a Sega Genesis and they were letting me play it, it was mostly a full what they call Tower of Power, which had the Master System with the CD-ROM edition and the 32X edition, and even the modifying plugin that would turn Sonic games into Sonic and Knuckle games. So that's a little bit of a boss fight. It kind of stinks though that you have so it is the right stick, so you can quick save, and then you can quick load, but it's not very fast because you have to press the right stick up and down. And if they were gonna make and emulate a system like that, then I don't see why they wouldn't have chosen to simply had it tap up and tap down. Well, I could see quick save. I could see maybe a confirmation prompt and pausing the game there, because you're not pausing the game when you're doing this. So the way I've set up RetroArch in the past, like the idea of, oh, I'm gonna die as I'm quick saving, which is just gonna put me in a bad position. Well, it's not as bad as you would think because it is rolling back time. Alright, see, if I saved now, I should be right around under the monkey. Nope, it doesn't roll back as much as I thought it did. But you can also see how this is just a standard game. There's nothing here. And we can hold the exit, and it will just leave the game paused. And yeah, there's no specific settings you can change. You could make the screen look curved, really curved if you wanted to. I don't know why anybody would want that. You can see the Master System down there. It's one start button, one 8-directional D-pad, and 3 buttons. No triggers. It does have online multiplayer. So, yeah. That's that game. And with the exception, I would say, of the Sonic series, which has continued, most of these Sega games are pure nostalgia with nothing that is a spiritual successor or any continuation on the series. And in fairness, I would say even the Sonic games very often go for a 3D world appearance and style that ruins the experience for modern Sonic games more often than it succeeds. Here we can see now in this next game, it is much more of an adventure looking game. You start with actual text. Shion. And seemingly you can't skip this text. Alright. You can see the camera is much more zoomed in. Interesting. It's still the fast forward and the quick save and quick load, but none of the buttons are working. Oh, I had to hit the B button fairly accurately. So now you swing your sword and it doesn't just magically shoot something in a direction. You have 3 hearts. You have something that is much more closer to something like the Adventures of Link. So it's not the B button, you just have to press back and be very centered. Once again, this world is being threatened. The princess has been kidnapped from Purapril Castle. You better use caution. Here's an elixir and firestorm. Take them with you. Make sure you're ready to use magic at all times. So you have to be exactly centered. And then it's not pressing up. In that case, it's pressing back. Yeah, this is some fairly rough controls, and I imagine this was exactly where this game played originally. I imagine this is pretty exact things. Can we purchase this? 30 gold. So 30 gold to buy items and upgrade. The Shantae series didn't actually have items. It's kind of interesting to see how none of the creatures you're killing are actually dropping gold. And it looks like my health filled up. You can definitely feel how this game is slower though. It's definitely... Yeah, all of a sudden in this screen everything is way slower. Interesting that interesting the coin bounced away from me and I was able to just walk in the water and not take any damage. So often in games, hitting the water is instant death. Or it's the introduction to some water section. This definitely feels like the old 8-bit style of games, though, even though, fairness, Master System sold itself as a 16-bit system and was mostly accurate on that. This is gonna put me in a weird position because I'll have about 30 coins and then I won't be able to do anything because I'll be so far away. Interesting. I don't know if I just used an elixir of life or what. But yeah, this definitely feels like a game where you have to work really, really hard to make the jumps, and you have to be pretty much edge perfect. Wow. And that's just straight to the screen. Alright. So those are the two Wonder Boy series that have remakes, and in the remakes they look much more modern, much more reasonable. There probably is some somewhat newer versions to the Virtua Fighter series, but I don't know if there's actually anything in the past decade. I didn't even know there was a Vector Man 2. There was a, I believe, Kickstarter Toe Jam and Earl game. Revenge of Shinobi, nothing new there. I believe there was a Golden Axe continuation or remake. I think maybe there might have been a remake for Gunstar Heroes. Phantasy Star Online is still going, or Phantasy Star 2 Online is going. I don't think Restar's done anything. Shadow Dancer I've never heard of. Shining in the Darkness I've never heard of. Shining Force, I don't think there's been anything there. Take note that Shinobi 3, Return of the Jedi Master, is not in the same group as the Revenge of Shinobi that starts with a T. So this is a very basic alphabetical ordering that seems like you can't really move things into your own order, which you might want to do. Well, you might want to at least be able to rename some of these things so that they alphabetically organize better. Sonic Hedgehog 1, 2, Sonic 3, and Knuckles. Like, this would be specifically where you should be able to use Sonic 3 and Knuckles as a way to play as Knuckles and Sonic 1. Streets of Rage, I believe there is a Streets of Rage 4 that came out and then was kind of quickly forgotten about because, well, in concept that sounds like that's an interesting game. It really isn't. And yeah, here you have a Sonic spin-off game, not in the Sonic section. eSWAT City Under Siege, Fatal Labyrinth Flicky game. So yeah, a lot of games here that I just don't even know what to say about anything, because I mean they're just old Sega games. Alex Kidd here might be somewhat close to the Monster Boy, Wonder Boy games. Let's see. But also it seems very, very simplistic visually. So you have a punch and a kick, and the kick gets you through. So you definitely had a lot of games like this. But this does also just feel like a game that is just all over the place. Really floaty jumps. A lot of stuff going on. A lot of coins. I will say the music is in stereo and kind of interesting to listen to, but the sliding on the ground was a constant problem that would occur. I had to press the punch button there to break that, even though it didn't animate the punch button. I guess you beat the level when you get the rice ball. But But I don't know how you describe this as anything other than just a weird game. And then, oddly, it breaks if you... apparently, if it can't slide, these orbs break. And it's just a one-hit die thing. So let me ask this question. Properly, I should now be able to go back to this and load a save slot of the quick load, because we definitely... So let's see, quick load. So that still does save it, good. Even though there seems to be a secondary save state versus a quick save and a quick load, which is fine. Let's just go through each of these games really quickly, and I'll give my brief 5-second initial idea on this. Now, if I was going through Nintendo games, I would pretty much say the same thing, that most of the Nintendo games, particularly the non-first party games, are interesting. That's quite a lot of setup for a game. Interesting. So it has like a weapon select and a very fast-paced shooter. This feels a little reminiscent of Cuphead, and I definitely know that Cuphead at points was trying very hard to emulate some of this type of gameplay. But the other thing I can say about this is that this is also just a nightmare style of gameplay, where it's very easy to take damage, it's very easy to get hit. Because games of the time were in this small resolution, you just had a high chance of getting hit if you were too far on one side of the screen. And when you get hit, what's going to happen? It's going to just be a game over. And this definitely feels like an arcade game, and probably was an arcade game. And seems like it started me on hard mode for some reason. Kind of feels like it would be nicer if there was an easier way to jump from game to game. But yeah, that definitely felt like an arcade game just designed to steal your quarters. And this looks like an Aliens ripoff game. Just a lot of games like this that are either... So that's a clear... You probably would want a... well, this flamethrower is a terrible weapon. You have to be really close. But the third button just rolls you. So you'd have to do a lot of this. And a lot of tapping on the button, because you would need a turbo controller, and you almost certainly would want to get like an 8-bit though like controller that more mimicked a Sega Genesis controller. For better or for worse, whether that's a good controller or not, it is going to make a lot more sense when trying to play these games versus bouncing between the triangular orientation of the X button, the B button, and the A button. And if you were just using RetroArch, you could probably remap some controllers specifically for certain games, because a game like this probably would work a lot better with a usage of usage of the triggers to do more things than just rewind and fast forward. The way I had RetroArch set up in my setups is to have the modifier button have a super button called that is the synchronization button, the center Xbox button that is the Xbox logo, a button that you never push and can never use in the game. I have that configured so you have to hold that down and then pull the right trigger or left trigger to rewind, or use the back button, which no old game would have any use for the back button, as the modifier button, so you hold down back and trigger. So it's a 2-button combination for more system-wide modifications, and that leaves you a lot more opportunity. There's nothing here. Like, I could probably play a lot of these games all the way to the end if I wanted to, but they have no relevance, and this is the thing that I run into as far as every single game I decide to put on my wish list and potentially play. This looks pretty bad, but that may just be the fact that the Master System looks this bad. This Altered Beast, probably a great example of a game that plays way better and looks a lot better if you just play with the arcade versions. Yeah, this does not feel like a good port. And the truth is, most console ports probably not as good as the arcade ports, because the arcade machines were the equivalents of like high-end gaming PCs for the time. Like, they were devices that they were planning on making money off of, not something built as cheap as possible to sell in general.
Welcome to your doom.
Altered Beast does have relevancy, but it's not particularly the best game to actually play. People remember it for its weirdness. They don't really, I think, remember it because it's actually a good game. You can see here, I'm just taking hits and dying. And there's far too many Sega games out there that just absolutely don't let you even continue if you want to, so that there's a definite problem with a lot of these old games in that sense. Where the arcade version, again, would have let you potentially put in more coins. Also, they would have potentially let you change the dip switches. This one looks pretty nice, but I think this is probably more on the lines of JRPGs. And even though Nintendo is a Japanese company as much as Sega is a Japanese company, and it was just two Japanese companies selling their consoles and their games, you definitely get a different advertising feel for Nintendo, in the sense that they were trying to specifically target kids and American people with the NES. They left all of the Japanese weird Famicom games alone in Japan and didn't try to port them over, where it definitely does seem more like this is another game that feels like it's set in like a India type Persian style world. You can definitely see with Sega though, they just tried to sell everything to everybody. A top-down hack and slash game. In a funny way, this is not probably influenced by Prince of Persia, but it certainly definitely shows that there was just a cultural zeitgeist of the idea of Persians with daggers, and Lawrence of Arabia certainly influenced all of that, and stories like that, and stories of Aladdin before Aladdin became nothing but Prince Ali. He became a solely owned by Disney property, or at least that's what Disney would like you to believe. Speaking of Disney, that is another point to mention here, is that there is absolutely none of the Disney games for the Sega Genesis here, and not really any of the third-party games at all, which I feel like that's a mistake, because the games that you would want to play almost certainly would be the Disney games for the Sega Genesis, at least somewhat, because I think a lot of people who would have been nostalgic for the Sega Genesis and the Master System, depending on what country, I suppose I should explain that in America they called it the Sega Genesis, everywhere else in the Western world they called it the Master System. Yeah, this looks interesting. It has a crouch down then jump ability, although it doesn't seem like you're going to use it too often. All these games still very much suffer from a low resolution, so when you get a game like this that has nice graphics, you then are hamstrung by a limited number of pixels otherwise that can be on the screen. Plus there's a sprite limit that they mentioned, and so games are limited to the number of enemies you could have on screen to make the game even playable, but also just on the idea of how well you could program your game anyways. So here we have like 5 sprites plus the player sprite, which you could probably double that. You could probably have about 10 of these types of creatures on the screen before it starts to get too crazy. Of course, then you also have to program them to run and be capable of... Interesting, I'm picking up like the cheese, which I don't think is actually a cheese item. Yeah, it is. It's an item you have to use. So let's see, there's whole RPG elements. Let's see if we can look at the map. And there's a whole world here. Well, I'll say that game, Beyond Oasis, actually is the first one to actually catch my attention, and it's also a game I've never heard of. I think you got a lot of different Sega load screens that they seem to highlight and try and promote the system more than the games themselves. But in my experience, what I would say, this is a shooter, obviously, although it took it its sweet time to play the music in the background before it decided it was actually going to throw these squids at me. So am I in the water or am I in space? I think I might be in the water. By modern standards, this is a fairly simplistic shooter, which is about the only kinds of shooters that I could actually play. And there's a way to manipulate the little bell around you, but it doesn't really work very well. So I don't know if I'm falling through the sky or the ocean, and then the ocean is just switching different color palettes. This also feels very much like maybe I'm falling outside of the ocean, because now I'm fighting bees. Yep, but it doesn't look like that game is going to do anything more than that. Biohazard Battle. Very simplistic game. I'm fairly certain the Sega emulator, you could find at least one of them that would try to skip the load screens somewhat, because there's just some annoyance there. So apparently I'm supposed to act as a robber and avoid detection. And the whole time you're gonna have a secondary screen. I guess you're supposed to shoot people? Like there's only seemingly one button here that does anything. Oh, you can lean against the door and lean against the walls. Interesting. Cover-based shooting, in a very early form of cover-based shooting. But also just a terrible game. Bonanza Brothers. Columns. Let's see. Columns, I believe, is just basically Tetris with a slight difference. Let's see. Start. Easy level 1. So the only difference between columns is the button spins the things in orientation. So you don't spin the outer shape so much like you would in Tetris. And I think that puts you also in a position where you can do slightly different things. So when I do this, it will do a 3 diagonal. Interesting. So if I do this, I'll get a double. So yeah, columns, fairly basic. And then it skips over to columns 3. They seem to not name any of their games 2, or they just skip over completely the second one. That also is probably an indicator that there isn't much of a difference between the first and second versions of a lot of Sega games, because they were just spitting them out as quickly as possible. But yeah, Columns 3 seems like it maybe has more music and more of a theme and maybe a level system to it, but mostly it seems like it is still just the same game. Although, in all fairness, I will say they did manage to polish up the graphics. And then there's apparently some other ways you can maybe mess with your opponent. And these standout games like Comic Zone here will, I think, were probably later releases, and they were people actually trying to do something amazing instead of just trying to sell basically toys. I'd say Comic Zone in particular is a great example of a character that he looks like a DC Marvel character from the mid-90s, and that's why you really couldn't have a remake of Comic Zone. He would feel very much just like a Duke Nukem Forever character. Of course, the problem with Comic Zone is going to be that there's just no like, you can turn on auto blocking, interesting, but, and you could probably change the controls a little bit, but there's no continues, I think, in Comic Zone, so most people couldn't get that far. New York City, present day. This totally looks like a Batman setup. So you have this guy with a mullet and a rat drawing. And somebody escapes from his drawing, and he gets drawn into it. His own drawings, the own comics. This almost certainly would be a Marvel or DC pickup. So the idea here is he jumps to different comics, and so you have to do a lot of beat 'em up, and then you can't go any further until you do beat 'em up. But you just have that life bar in the top right, which is a weird place. And this is very reminiscent of the Looney Tunes cartoon where the animator is messing with Daffy Duck, and then it zooms out eventually, and it's Bugs Bunny who's doing the drawing. Let's see, and then you have choices as far as where you're gonna go. But I just missed the pickup. I cannot even figure out how to use the power-ups because it's the right trigger apparently. But if the right trigger does this and the left trigger does this, what does... Oh, it's the Y button that does that. And see, this is a cool idea that certainly could have been something. And it definitely was something at the time, as it definitely looks different and it definitely feels more mature than what Nintendo was offering. These guys won't even attack me if I try to use them. There you go. I suppose it's worth mentioning that the left trigger triggers the thing on the right side, and the right trigger triggers the thing on the left side. So there's just like a full... there's like a full system there that's where the controls are backwards. You would think, since this is for the layman person, not somebody who knows how to set up and configure an emulator, they would have gotten the button configurations right. And yep, you get exactly one life. I don't believe in Comic Zone you ever get a second life. And if there's anything you can do, it'll just be to continue. Nope. It just resets the whole system. So I could see remaking comics out, but I don't know what end. Really, you should just make a Deadpool video game, and really there probably are 2 or 3 good Deadpool video games already. You can even see in like the logo design of a lot of the characters, they had a very bad standard in which it was just a title on a grid for a lot of these early Sega Genesis Master Systems games. So here's Crackdown. It's just going to be a top-down twin-stick shooter. Nothing like the 3D jumping platforming game where you collect a bunch of ability orbs and other kinds of orbs. Right. And see, this is basically the equivalent of a it's like one hit and then you reset. And you have an explosion and a single shot. And you only have so many bullets. Or you can switch between bullets and punching. But just look at how much of the screen is not being used, or being used just really inefficiently, in the sense that you're constantly taking up only a quarter of the screen. I guess I disarmed that bomb. Set the time bombs, it says. Oh, I'm setting the time bombs. Interesting. So I missed one somewhere. These are just like constantly refreshing, and there's just an arbitrary timer on this for no reason. You have a limited number of bullets, you have a limited number of time. Then you go to another level. Yeah, that is not a game you really want to play. And let's just mention here that probably in the first volume you got Sonic 1, and then you probably got 5 or 6 other games that weren't worth playing. And then in the next volume you got Sonic 2, and then 5 or 6 more games not worth playing. That's really what this is going to boil down to, is that of slightly over 2 shelves worth of games, there really is only about 5 games worth playing. A decap attack. Interesting. So your head is in your stomach. You seem to have like a hovering ability or a delayed fall ability. Well, geez, I don't even know how you're supposed to get up. And it takes 3 hits to pound somebody into the ground. Interesting. I don't think any of the more Halloween-esque games, though, really ever could have had a good chance of succeeding. And like a lot of games of the time, you are just kind of ending up in the exact same position and doing the exact same thing in the first levels for a long time. odds of you actually even making it to the ending of a certain level are fairly low in a lot of old school games. So let's see what happens when we die. Seems like you have 2 hearts, but that you can take multiple hits per heart. And it doesn't refill your health. Yeah, it really is the Wild West where you maybe have a certain number of lives, you maybe have a continue system, but a lot of these games are totally not designed to work that way. A lot of these games, if you did try to just save state and cheat your way through them, you might hit points where it's actually literally impossible to win. There's quite a few games in the first or second generation of console games that are like that. Depending on whether you want to put the NES and the Master System in the first generation with Commodore 64 and Ataris, or you want to call them second generations. I think realistically you probably should call the NES and the Master System the second generation of consoles, because the first generation of consoles, Atari, they had already made the mistakes that I would argue Sega made with the Master System, and in the fact that they just had no quality control at all. They didn't really care, and thus they created a bad situation for themselves where they were highly likely to not succeed. And while there was success to be had for Sega for a very long time, in the end Sega now basically just runs casinos, and actually the Akihabara arcade that they ran has recently been shut down, so that's not going to work for them. Apparently you can't do diagonal in the Mean Bean Machine setup, but you can do squares. But then they also drop some spoiler pieces. So that leaves Sega in a weird position where they don't really have a lot that they can do these days to be a video game company and be successful as a video game company. Also, you have the problem of Sega at the moment, when they sell things like this, basically selling you the work of somebody who maybe in Japan, because of their unions, the person who made Mean Bean Machine still works at Sega, but I guarantee you they're not seeing an extra penny on the sales of this. They're not getting a bonus check for that. So who are you really benefiting at that point, other than just some manager who wasn't probably even the manager when Mean Bean Machine was made, who then is going to spend that money running Sega's arcades, their pachinko machines, their pachinko parlors, which are basically just gambling, that's not specifically just an issue with Sega. It's also an issue with Konami, where Konami is basically completely out of the business of making video games at this point, and they simply are trying to license and make money off of the work of others, to the small disenfranchisement of the rest of society, because they're charging a price. They're trying to make money off something that they put no energy into, and they just are license holders and sitting on it. If there was a public domain system around the world, but specifically in Japan, if the copyrights were treated more liberally, I suppose is the right phrase to use. I don't even know if I'm controlling a character right now, or if this is just an intro sequence. It seemed like I can control this character, and I'm the yellow guy, and this robot is just grabbing all the pink guys, so I guess I'm gonna just go save, which that is basically the start of Sonic 2, is that all his friends get stolen and kidnapped. Yeah. There is this concept of abandonware, and then at a certain point, you legally, I'm sure Sega will say, well, these games are not abandonware. Look, we're still selling them. We're still trying to make money off them. Apparently that was a movie. But he apparently hits people with his head. Interesting. His head bounces off his neck. And here in the background you can see very Japanese like silk prints. So there's a camera like light in the top left that I think might be an indicator of my life. So I may be about to die. Yeah. So yeah, you have an H here, and you have a whole tutorial system. And then this is just super slow, trying to... I guess I was supposed to be attacking this guy. Well, it sure doesn't feel like I'm gonna win against these guys. Like, I'm hitting him as hard as possible, and he's not hitting me. So that seems like you can't succeed here. And I don't know if it's trying to show credits in the, I think it kind of is. But yeah, I've lost interest in this game because I shouldn't have died on the first level. Dynamite Yeti. Yeah, I think it is probably more realistic to say, hey, this probably should be in the public domain. NES and Master System games should be in the public domain. If somebody wants to make a remaster of it, and they could have the well, see, that's where copyright comes into it. Does it really hurt society or help society to let Sega decide to make a yet another bad Sonic game that has the exclusive rights to be called a Sonic game, when had the first Sonic game lost its copyright after 30 years, and then anybody could have made a Sonic game. So this is not even, I think, the port of Echo you would want to play. So the aliens have come. If you don't know the story of Echo the Dolphin, the aliens come, they basically kidnap all the fish in the world, and you are echoing with the dolphins and trying to investigate it and save a whole bunch of people. And then there's kind of a puzzle system, and there's kind of a ability system and some crystals. You have to start off by getting enough momentum so that you can get the right angle to be able to jump over this to get to further sections. It's a real weird game, but it was a very popular game, and I can see why, because it's basically only using one button for the most part, which is just the A button to dash forward and move. So it's a good game for little kids to see a pretty dolphin and just bounce around and spend 20 minutes on it, not knowing any of the story, possibly not even knowing the whole thing about this, where you have to search for keys and that will open these crystal gates. Also, you only want to hit those once, so it will pop up the thing multiple times with your sonic attack. There are a couple of shark games where you play as a shark that have been developed recently that I think would somewhat fall in similar ways. There are also bubbles of oxygen somewhere, but I'm not seeing it. Let's see. I'm not sure if you have a continuation if you run out of oxygen, which I'm about to do, or if you have to start the whole game over again. Again, so many of these Master System games were super short. They were definitely shorter often than NES games. And just compared to Nintendo, they outside of Sonic, so it does just reset you, there just isn't as much there. Like, I can name NES football, golf, I believe there was a tennis game, Punch-Out, the Adventures of Link, The Legend of Zelda, which was the game before that. I can see what else would be Super Mario Brothers 1, 2, and 3, Donkey Kong, Duck Hunt with the Zapper. There was no Zapper. No first-party Zapper for the Master System. I think there might have been a third-party Zapper. I don't even know what the actual story of Echo the Dolphin 3 is, but I'm fairly certain you go back in time, considering that was the subtitle on it. This definitely feels like a story that is being written by someone who decided to take some LSD and write the story from after an acid trip. And teleport rings and Atlanteans. Interesting. And now it doesn't seem like you need oxygen in the third game, or in this sequel. Is this the third game, or is this just the sequel? Right. And then you have a 3D experience. This is cool and all, but is this really what you want? Apparently you do need oxygen. And apparently you will have to go through multiple rings, which, again, this happens in Sonic. So even the spin-off games for Sega really were copying a lot from Sonic. Which, in all fairness, I think a lot of the third-party NES games probably were copying a lot from the first-party Nintendo games also. I would also say I think there's probably about 500 NES games that were ever released. I could be wrong. Whereas I think there was probably a couple hundred less Master System games. But the actual quality is the difference there. Even the Disney games and the kids games, which is what I think are probably the most still relevant, because I could imagine a 2, 3, 4-year-old playing a Master System Disney game and like Aladdin, for instance, and there might be some relevance still there, and there might be something of interest there. This is oddly taking too long. Maybe you have to speed through it. Yeah, you tap A to speed. But it's only counting some of the rings I'm going through, not all of them. I'm about to hit the edge of the world. Now all my rings are missing in the top left. That just took forever. And so it gives you a save code because nothing had any memory. Okay, Echo the Tides of Time, and then here you have Echo Junior, which I imagine are the more kid-friendly games. Also, this probably might have been for the Game Gear, the Game Boy competitor, which in all fairness, the Game Gear I think was a much better system than the Game Boy, but the Game Boy had the battery life and Nintendo already had the fandom there. Well, the buttons are in different places now. And this does seem like he's moving more. That definitely seems like you've got more speed. There. So this is probably a great example of them just speeding up the programming and having it run better. This also looks better, although it also looks different. This probably would have looked a lot better on the Game Gear, or just the limitations of the Game Gear required it to have this appearance. I'm not sure what I'm supposed to be doing though. Whether I'm supposed to just... Oh, this literally is find the fish. Interesting. So it's a hide and seek game. None of the weirdness. And it looks like you can cheat the game fairly easily too. Well, yeah, this is kind of a great example of what I'm talking about, where this is probably where you're supposed to go, but you have to echo the fish first. But yeah, this is a great example, I think, of where a kid-friendly game for a very young kid to play before they end up getting a Nintendo Switch or an iPad in their hand too often. And in all fairness, mobile gaming on iPads or Android tablets or even cell phones is still fairly bad, so I wouldn't be surprised if a lot of these games, old games in general, might still somewhat hold up, just on the fact that I don't need to do that twice. But yeah, I could see just trying to give your kid the general idea of, hey, you've played this once. These are games that I had to play when I was when I was your age or even younger. I just got an achievement for probably playing over 50 games and just loading over 50 games. It might be fairly easy to get all the achievements in this. And because I imagine the achievements really are simplistic, just load 50 games and thus own 50 games. They started to sort of do that with a lot of games where they were trying very hard to make you just buy achievements, and in this case that's exactly what it is interesting. You have to jump and shoot, no 8-way directionality on this. Well, that's gonna make this a fairly slow and boring game. It is also a sad indication of the times in the United States too, and I feel like police have really dropped the ball on this, and they've made themselves much closer than you would want them to be as far as the bad guys in black. A SWAT member wearing full military armor in black. Even the average police officer these days is wearing almost all black, not blue. So even though they claim the thin blue line, it's like, yeah, we're wearing blue in the sense that we're wearing a shade of black that has a little blue tint in it. But look at this guy. He's got tan pants on. He's got a bright blue shirt. That's the way the police used to dress for at least a while there. Not to say that the police were inherently any more just in the old days, but at least they weren't coming out. And we are in this like dangerous position in the United States where the police are potentially just gonna come dressed as the Punisher with skulls and crossbones over their outfits and make themselves try to be as intimidating and as evil, for lack of a better term, as possible. And certainly there is the idea of the uniform making the man. It's not usually fully that unnuanced, but here we have a game called Eternal Champions. This looks like this would be interesting, so this must play fairly bad in the sense that I've never heard of it. Yeah, this probably is just a very, very bad fighting game. Which, in all fairness, not a lot of fair fighting games in the NES by comparison. By the way, unless Nintendo decided, and by Nintendo I mean Nintendo of Japan, decided to respect fair use, I would never cover any of their games, old or new. So if they did release all of a bunch of ROMs of the of NES games, and I could play like Punch Out and stuff, like I'd like to do a spotlight on that and show that off, certainly. But Nintendo has just their dumb little ambassador program that they finally gave up on, but they're still not very clear. Fighting games in general, though, even though there wasn't a lot of them on the NES, there was tons of them in the arcade, and they played a lot better. So, like, you are better off to stick with an arcade emulation of Street Fighter or Marvel vs. Capcom than playing this game. Maybe you play something like Darkstalkers if you want something a little bit weirder. This doesn't, again, feel like the input on the Xbox One controller is really triggering to an 8-way control, so I imagine it is just 4-way inputs. I wouldn't be surprised if the Master System actually only had 4 switches under its 8-way gamepad anyways, so and thus people didn't really program it, but that definitely does not feel like a fast-paced enough fighting game, nor a particularly interesting fighting game. And it's really weird that they kind of dropped the ball and didn't continue to go with the more 32-bit games, because that's when I think the Master System and the Sega Genesis games started to get really good, is the 32-bit games. Once they had a handle on it, they had sort of a rough start compared to the NES, which sold very well as a toy. Well, this is a top-down kind of dungeon crawler. None of my buttons seem to let me do anything now. Picked up leather armor. Picked up a shuriken. Like, you've seen like games like Crypto the Necrodancer that seem sort of like this. They don't move until you move, but in the case of Crypto the Necrodancer, you have to actually move on the beat sometimes too. You have to point in the direction and try and fight these guys and hit a button. And I guess the question is, I'm about to die. There's a lot of the screen being taken up, certainly, but when I die, is that a rogue game where you just start all over, or do you get some XP, and is it a roguelite game versus a roguelike game? No, this is a roguelike in the sense that no progress carries over, and it's practically impossible to recommend playing any kind of roguelike. So I think what we'll do, since we're going fairly long here, is we'll break this up into a two-part spotlight. We'll do the first row and the two Monster Boy games, which started me down this path. I've definitely thought about covering these games, but it's been hard to justify. This is a clone of Joust, basically. You are running around trying to collect all the little birds before the cats catch you. Yep. And that's about all I need to see of that game. Flicky, no surprise. This would be it'd be a game, I suppose. It would be worth it. If I was to, let's see, left bump and favorite it, then you put it in that side, okay? So you can move it on the other side of the dice and favorite it, the games. Which, let's play around with this. What are the games that I think you actually should own? Altered Beast has relevancy. Maybe Columns 1 and maybe Columns 3 has relevancy. Comic Zone has relevancy. Echo the Dolphin has relevancy. And we'll have a running list here of games that actually are worth playing. But then the really important games were never really the really good games for the Sega systems were never first-party games, and a lot of them were like Sega CD games. So I don't think I own the re-release of Night Trap, which is very historically important because of it being involved negatively in the creation of the ESRB rating system for games. This is a top-down twin-stick shooter that is just really, really, really slow. This could be like a Robotron clone, but even by Robotron standards, it's incredibly slow. And then there was one that I liked called Double Switch that I do own the PC re-release of that remaster. It's not really a remaster, it's just a re-release, and that's what they're doing there. And I'd say Night Trap and Double Switch. There's also one called Burn Cycle that I don't think you can get at the moment, or hasn't been released in a playable form for quite a long time. I remember playing that. And then there's Sewer Shark, which would be maybe an argument to that, to playing that. And then that's about it. And I think there probably was only about 20 Sega CD games worth mentioning in the first place, and the history has caused that number to decrease down to about 4 now. I mean, you can get Plumbers Don't Wear Ties, which is like a porno full motion video game that I don't think really has any actual porn in it, or if it does, it's by modern standards so bad and so tame that it wouldn't even really matter. Well, this is a great point to mention. I hate fly around space games, and I definitely would not want to play an old fly around space game unless it was really, really important, and I don't know of any really, really important fly around space games out there. So more than likely in the second part of this episode, we're going to get all the good games. Golden Axe, Gunstar Heroes. We'll look at like this second row with all the S games. There's way better potential here than that first row. Yeah. And we'll keep a list here just to see how many of these really are worth it. And if you bought these individually for 99 cents, what would you really be paying? Because right now I'm saying this is about $7 worth of games that they were selling individually for 99 cents at one point. Now I think it's bundled for about $20. And in actuality, I don't think that there's enough value there. Honestly, I would make the argument that these are games that are close enough, in my moral opinion, to be abandonware, and if you were just to go find the ROMs and use RetroArch, you'd have a probably better experience, at least a more customizable experience as far as the controls, and you could pick and choose the 1 or 2 games you really want to play and just run those ROMs. Or you go the other direction with it and you say, hey, I don't want to pick and choose anything. I want to own every single Sega Genesis Master System game out there, all 500 or so of them, however many there really are. I think it probably is somewhere around 500. And then you just go get a very large set of ROMs by sailing the high seas, and you still would be served better in that form, because then you'd be getting a lot of games that maybe are not translated to English, so or just not available for sale in whatever country, United States generally. You get a lot of games that are not owned by Sega directly. This whole room interface is, I think, also disingenuous by quite a bit. you're not going to have there was no Sega super fan that would have had Golden Axe posters and Shinobi posters on their walls, and then you have a TV that's plugging into a power strip when power strips would have been few and far between, and then you have these big old speakers that those would have been really expensive too. Yeah, this is a depiction of a fantasy world, not a depiction of a real world. The phone is off the hook. I guess they don't get it. And then most kids wouldn't have even been allowed to have a TV in their bedroom back when the Master System existed, let alone a TV hooked up to a loud sound system and a video game console and a giant wooden axe and skateboard. Or quite, I would believe the skateboard. I don't believe the giant wooden axe. But yeah, that doesn't have anything to do with anything. I was just looking at it. That's going to be where we end this spotlight, or this first part of the spotlight. And then we'll come back and we'll look at the other games and give our 5-second opinions on them. My 5-second opinions would be about the same for most NES games. They probably would be about the same for most Super NES games and PlayStation games too. Even when you start getting up to the area of Wii games, I would say almost all the third-party Wii games are fairly low quality. Nintendo 64 games did have fewer games, and they tended to be a bit higher quality. And there definitely are noteworthy Nintendo 64 games. So, like, if Nintendo was going to re-release Super Mario 64 or Mario 64 and some of those games, that would be amazing. Like Ocarina of Time and the Zelda games and the Metroid games, Metroid Prime games. Once you start getting into the later, Nintendo 64 is still fairly hard to emulate, but a modern gaming PC should be able to do that fairly well. But like Wii and GameCube games, at that point, those are the kind of games that I would feel like a offering like this would make sense, is if Nintendo or PlayStation were releasing and offering PlayStation 1, PlayStation 2, PlayStation 3 even games on PC through emulation. That would be really nice, but PlayStation doesn't do that. Nintendo doesn't do that. Microsoft doesn't really do that either, in the sense that Microsoft's first party and third party titles that came out for the original Xbox or the Xbox 360, and not enough of them have been ported to PC either. And certainly there's been more Xbox 360 games that have been remastered to be re-released on the Xbox One, and when they did that effort, they also ported it to run on PC. And that's kind of the beauty of the Xbox, I think, more than any other console, is that it drug a lot of game developers kicking and screaming into the world of making games that just run on a PC x86 style processor, versus the PlayStation's 3 effort to push everybody into using their weird cell processors, or Nintendo's efforts, which is to basically always have underpowered consoles that for the last few generations that can't actually play games as well as even a mid-tier gaming PC could. But yeah, I do think that there would be room for PlayStation 1, Wii U emulations, and games like that being re-released, more than trying to sell on nostalgia and then oversell very much. This is really a bad deal as far as what you should be really paying for it, because it probably in my personal opinion, I would, if I was the one making the laws, I would say all these games from this era should be public domain right now. That anybody should be able to just download a ROM and play them. And de facto, that kind of is the case. Like, nobody's really gonna go to jail downloading ROMs. Individuals aren't gonna go to jail. Nintendo has shut down some ROM linking sites, certainly, and people sharing the ROMs with other people, but it's not worth anyone's time to have that kind of court case. But yeah, I think that is the realm of ROMs. Is they should be fairly devalued. They should be free in public domain, to the point where it should let new game developers who grew up playing games like Sonic 1 to make games very similar to Sonic 1, using even Sonic and his name and his likeness in their own games, which would be what would be the public domain part of that. The copyrights get a little fuzzy as far as whether the actual code of the games is public domain versus the copyrights on the names and likenesses and the story of the characters. But that too are court cases that haven't really been settled. I think society would be heavily benefited if there were dozens of people trying to make Sonic games right now, instead of not even Sega really trying to make Sonic games that are good. Anyways, that's going to be it for this recording. Come back for part 2. As always, I ask you to like, share, subscribe, comment, and watch every second of my videos. If you want a friend or follow me on any social media sites, there's a whole bunch of links down below in the description box. And if you want to support me further, there's a link to Patreon, or you can friend me on Steam and gift me a game off my wishlist. Thank you for watching. Have a good evening.